Okay, so Mabrika, welcome to our NR65 Community-Based Natural Resource Management course here on Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho homelands, what's now known as Colorado State University in the beautiful Front Range of Northern Colorado. Every year we offer this course, hence the name. We connect to community in every way that we can. We have a great cohort of students here that are very excited, especially to hear from voices in the field, practitioners that are really out there putting these practices to work on the ground. And I'm very excited today to welcome one of my favorite Montanans and CSU alum, Dr. Hailey Wilmer, who's joining us. I'll just share a little bit about Dr. Wilmer as I welcome you in, and then I'm excited to turn the class over to you. So Dr. Hailey Wilmer is a Research Rangeland Management Specialist at the USDA-ARS Range Sheep Production Efficiency Research Unit in Idaho, originally from Southwest Montana. And Hailey's a former high school agriculture teacher and completed her graduate degree program right here in Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at CSU. Prior to joining the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station staff in 2021, Dr. Wilmer worked at the USDA-ARS in Fort Collins as a social scientist with the U.S. Forest Service in Juneau, Alaska. And so with that, I just want to say Mabrika and home, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share with us. I'm going to turn the camera over now to our students. Let's see. Can you all give a wave and welcome to Dr. Wilmer? And hopefully you can hear us, and I'll turn it over to you now. So thanks again for joining.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction. It's a real huge honor to be asked to speak to this class, and I hope we can have a bit of a dialogue because, as Dominique said, I work in a pretty rural part of Idaho, and I really enjoy giving guest lectures because I get to connect with people who are thinking about this stuff and reading the literature and maybe developing your own projects. So I'd love to just hear feedback and critiques and comments and discussion. So I have 46 slides, but I'll try not to talk so long so that we can maybe chat a little bit about some of these ideas or some things that you're picking up from in the class. I took this class in 2013 or 14 when I was kind of transitioning between my master's and PhD. And I don't think that we took it at the same time, but it was kind of in a transition for me, sort of intellectually, where I was kind of being faced with some of the contradictions in the dominant worldview that I knew from my undergraduate training and what we were experiencing on the ground in my research project, and then some of the more critical literature that was emerging in natural resource management at the time. So it was a really fun class, and actually some of the people that I made friends with are still collaborators and still friends to me. And the definition of friendship that I like to go with is that a good friend won't let you live in your delusions. It's from a friend of mine named Isaac. And so friends that I met in this class have been good checks on my delusions over the years. They've made sure that I'm, thinking clearly or questioning my assumptions as I go about my work, and stay pretty humble in that space because there's so much to do. So yeah, it's really neat to be back into this class, and I'll kind of cover a two-part talk. This doesn't really happen in the social sciences, but in ecology, folks like to cover the paper that they talked about in the reading just from like a understanding perspective. So I'll give you kind of my rundown of the reading. It doesn't mean you might not have you might have a different interpretation of it, but I'll talk about that ethics framework that you all had in your reading list, and then I'll talk about a newer project that relates to this idea of transdisciplinary research evaluation or reflection, where we're kind of taking those principles or just trying to do this kind of work in a real setting and learning from it as well. So I don't know if there are any immediate questions that anybody had about the framework that I could address now or here, so I can kind of work it into the rundown.
Yeah, I had
but
one.
If you've got some, yeah.
I had actually a comment I forgot to share, which is that we have a Jamboard.
Oh, cool.
I'm gonna drop it in the chat. It's linked under this week's module. It's a space where you all can drop questions or comments for Dr. Wilmer during any time in the talk. And then
Cool.
I can hang out up here and try to moderate that too.
Okay.
Actually, you'll be able to see them too as they come in. So I'll go
I
ahead and
think I
drop
can
that
see
link.
them. Okay. I'm gonna open the chat in the other window.
Looks like some folks are already joining, so that's great. Yeah. There's
Cool.
that Jamboard link for you in the chat, Hailey.
Cool. Okay. Pull it up over on this side. If I miss something because I get tunnel vision going through slides, let me know, please. Sorry.
Yeah,
Try
no
to manage
problem.
all the screens. It's like the big mission control over here. Okay, so it's kind of a two-part talk, but I guess it should be a three-part talk. So I'd love to hear from you all as we go along. So during COVID, I didn't have much opportunity to go out and actually conduct the qualitative research that I like to do. And I was working in Juneau. I was kind of like locked in my living room. So I got some friends together and we wrote up this paper that covered this issue that we'd been running into a lot. And a lot of us that are on this paper had worked in different settings, maybe more in climate or maybe more in rangeland. But we were running into this phenomenon whereby an ecologist would discover the importance of social systems and then work with a young social scientist, sometimes a woman, or you know, a very early career individual who is hired, like tagged onto a project, or maybe an extension specialist or community-based practitioner of some sort, and sort of leverage themselves into the world of the community to engage with the social science, but maybe it wasn't being done in a way that came from a place where we were left with good long-term relationships, or we were left with a lot for the community. And Dr. David Chavez has written about this quite a bit in her communities with reviews of the outcomes in different projects. And we thought, well, we would always go back, we'd say, well, you should take your human subjects training. And then we realized like we're not actually always doing social science on these communities, where sometimes we're doing ecological research with them. And so maybe it's a completely different framework that we need to think about, because it applies in kind of a different way, if that makes sense. So here is a QR code to this part of the presentation, but it's pretty well laid out in the paper as well. There's also a webinar on, I think, the Northwest Casks website that Allison Meadow led, if you would like to watch a much more concise summary of the framework that she did. So we know, I mean, how many of you have taken human subjects research training, the IRB? A few, yeah. So you're probably familiar with the concepts of beneficence, respect for persons, and justice, which frame out the IRB thinking. And I think the trainings have gotten a lot more robust and a lot more contextual since I took them in like 2014 for the first time. But in some ways, the Belmont principles don't really help us think about doing work with communities, not just on them. So as we're getting more funding for transdisciplinary approaches in natural resource management, I think it's increasingly important that we have, you know, frameworks to fill the gap between researchers and communities so that we're respecting them when we do work with them. So here's the Gigi Owen created amazing framework that we developed, and it takes those principles of respect for persons, justice, and beneficence from the Belmont principles, and it expands them through a pretty extensive synthesis of the literature to include 4 new themes: representation, self-determination, reciprocity, and deference, and then 2 cross-cutting themes, which are the dark green here. So beyond human sphere of interest and ethics, so beyond working with people, but also working with other non-human elements of our environment or relations, and then acquiring skills as ethical practice. So kind of this ongoing idea of like, it's a process and you've got to build skills to do this well. So, this is our don't be a jerk framework. And it's been really fun to put it together because it's a good actually like litmus test of your own projects. When you write something like this, you're like, oh, wow, this is a conversation and an ongoing, effort for myself as well. And we didn't put this together. A lot of times, like I'll give this presentation and folks will ask me, well, what do I do about this situation? And I can't really tell you that, right? I can just provide a framework for you to think through with your team some of those issues. So representation, which is the practice of mindfulness of how we represent other people and communities, as well as non-human elements of our research. So how do we think about who we're working with? How do those individuals identify and represent themselves, their lands, and their environments? Are all members of your research team prepared and committed to engagement with community and non-academic partners? This is something we've run into with rangelands a lot. There may be some folks working with us that aren't prepared to sort of have these conversations with different members of the community that they don't normally work with. And then what are the risks to the partners for participating in the work? So a classic example here, this is a fence line contrast between two long-term grazing studies on the research ranch that I work on. So you can think a lot about how you take a picture and what that says about the landscape and what that might say about the people in the landscape. Is one side of this fence healthier or better or just different than the other? And it maybe depends on your goals, and it might just be the weather. So and I think a really important concept for me in this work is understanding the conceptualization of the other, or how othering of it in terms of representing someone as the other plays a role in how we think about natural resource management in our own research. So anytime you see someone sort of casually generalized to, or basically stereotyped, right? It's important to keep in mind that that knowledge about someone, that representation, can be linked to power and can be linked to how they're viewed or stigmatized in the broader community. And this is, just my pet peeve in ecological research, that we treat communities as a monolith, or we represent them as someone other than like us. And there's, I think, lots of implications in the field that I work in rangelands, where we've seen stereotypes or misconceptualizations about the impacts, for example, of grazing on the landscape that really serve to help remove pastoralists from the land, for example, when it may not actually be those practices that are driving the processes that we're worried about, or there may be ulterior motives going back in history. And when we see the diversity of landscapes, we can imagine like how challenging it would be to stereotype, or to tell only parts of the story about all of these different rangeland systems, for example. Related to that is the idea of self-determination. And it's really just this idea that a community has a fundamental right to collaborate on their own terms and for their own benefit. And this can be pretty challenging for pure social scientists to think about, but also for ecologists to think about. So some questions to ask would be, is there a role for communal knowledge, like traditional or local knowledge, in your project? And if so, who is consenting to the terms of the project, and how will the data and information be managed? And we were really lucky to have Stephanie Carroll Russo as a co-author on this project. And the Global Indigenous Data Alliance has a lot of resources online. And I just pulled their first, the kind of wanted to splash the page up. It's hard to provide a link. I should probably put in like a QR code where you can explore the ideas of the CARE principles for data sovereignty, which include collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, that kind of expand conventional FAIR principles of data management to this data sovereignty concept. And I think it's worth thinking about really carefully, no matter what field you work in or what kind of transdisciplinary project that you're working on. Any thoughts there from the group before I just keep rambling?
Yeah, I'm happy to share the CARE principles with everybody in the discussion board. I can post those. And there are some great questions coming in to the Jam board. If you wanna, I can read them off to you if that's helpful. Or if you wanna peek in at those and see if this might be a good time to.
Yeah.
You're also, she can hear you, so you're welcome to just, whoever posted the questions, jump in and ask, since it's a natural pause. They're really good questions, whoever posted them. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about, I don't know if it fits in now, but it's particularly like you're working with the USDA and other federal agencies. If there are IRB like review boards that you've interacted with at the agency level, because I've worked closely with like Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and we have not really come across at least an IAPA board for like animal care use, but I don't know as far as IRB goes.
Yeah, we actually do not have a federal IRB, and actually USDA did not sign on to the common rule, which almost every other federal agency signed on to. So I'm not actually required to go through IRB at like that level, but it is our policy to partner with a university partner to go through IRB. And you mentioned state agencies. Yeah, they also, I would imagine, would work with their, whichever university is local to them. We do have, and it's been a fairly recent, and I should have brought this up too. I think we get to it later, but we do have an IACUC system across the federal, which is animal care. So we do have the board for that, and that's really similar thinking. We're also held to other regulations in terms of how we look at environmental use. So I actually have to go through a review process for large scale experiments that are similar to what Forest Service does with NEPA. So there are multiple scales of it for us, and there are other regulations about collecting data when you're a fed that make it basically impossible to do quantitative work very quickly. But yeah, we don't have an IRB. Was there another question? I don't know if I saw it.
There was,
Maybe my little thing was over it. Sorry.
it was also
Okay.
Sam.
My secondary question was
It was a
sort of,
great question.
how can like I know in the framework, in like the overarching sort of like green, like beyond human sphere of interest and ethics, like I was wondering how can those non-person entities be considered when developing sort of experimental ethics for transdisciplinary work? Like we have IACUC committees, but a lot of those are like, how are you going to be implementing? Like, I mean, I don't know. I was internationally talking with some colleagues who are working on implementing sort of more ethics for non-person entities in their consideration. So
yeah, what thoughts do you have about that? I mean, I don't know what kind of systems you work in, but
I work specifically in like fisheries, so a lot of fish, but I mean, I've seen a lot of colleagues and stuff obviously work in areas where like you're taking a lot of fish, their sacrifices, mortalities and other things. But I don't know, I thought it's an interesting extension of what ethics can be beneficial and like applied to those sort of entities as well.
yeah, I mean, IACUC does a really good job of that, but still a lot of our stuff is invasive or even I work more in like vegetation science, and you'll drive through the pasture and there's old rebar out there. So thinking about the whole life cycle of your project, but we tried to apply these principles, the 4 principles, to each, to the non-humans as well. So how are you representing them? Are they, given opportunities for self-determination? How are you giving back, maybe restoring the land after, or making it better than you ever did? That's a real challenge in my field, because sometimes you've got to kind of like, if you want to understand how cheatgrass invasion works, you've got to try to invade something with cheatgrass, right? And so there's a trade-off there. Yeah, so it's definitely worth thinking about, and maybe having having thought through it, think 30 years ahead in terms of the benefits versus the cost and to whom. And then another thing I think that comes in with like representation and self-determination is if you're working with an ecosystem or a species or a land base, there are other people that have a connection and knowledge to that land. And so how are you being respectful of their sage grouse or their connections to that sage grouse. And how are you thinking through it in your work with communities as well? So.
Yeah, someone else's work who I might mention, Brian, do you mind grabbing that? Is Max Liverone, who runs the Clear Lab at Memorial University. They work on plastics in ocean ecosystems and have been really exploring protocols and practices around that, for even like returning beings back to the waters after running analyses and such. So that's another person's work. I respect, similar to Dr. Wilmer here. Check out.
Yeah, those are good questions. And I work at an animal science lab, and I was like, well, what are these sheep eating? And my boss was like, well, if you really want to know, you got to knock a few in the head and find out. And I was like, okay, new research question. So, like some fields are more comfortable with that than others, but yeah, like we're using models more. I think iCook has a lot of good ideas. We're using models more to understand those things. Yeah, it's definitely, there's no simple answer at all. So yeah, okay. And then, yeah, I'll move on real quickly. Reciprocity, the principle that participants should receive direct benefit from the research in which they contribute. How do you do this if you're running a quantitative survey of 2,000 people? Is just giving them the data when you're done enough? What if you are doing a study of whether ranchers believe climate change or not? Are they going to benefit from that study, or is there a benefit to society that's greater than, sort of the cost of that community? I think it poses some really important challenges to us in terms of how we're thinking about this work on a project that actually just managed to create one new permanent job in the community, and it's a very small community, so that was seen as like a good form of reciprocity, but there might be other ways to think about it. So what do your partners say that they would like to have happen? What will you as a researcher get from the research, and how does that contrast with how other people will benefit? And how will the funds be distributed in the process? Who's receiving them and who's not? And I think this even goes for like the crew that you work with and for, like, what is the experience like of the project? How does it feel? Are you having fun? Is it enjoyable or is it painful? Are you giving people, something they want to be part of? Deference does not mean subsuming your own way of thinking or developing knowledge to others, but rather being cognizant of the practical reality that all knowledge communities have specific ways of developing and validating knowledge. So deference questions would be, what assumptions about knowledge development and validation do you and other members of your team hold? How do you hope to bring different ways of knowing together in your work? And is your team engaging with intellectual traditions across and beyond disciplines? This is my friend Steve Cox. He's helping me locate some potential plot locations, and he's a gosh darn expert on this piece of land. I don't think he's ever looked at our quantitative data, but he certainly knows a lot as a manager. Management is not a failed version of science, right? We need one another in that space. So just, kind of a toy example here. So some cross-cutting themes. We've already kind of talked a little bit about the beyond human piece. Here's some questions you could ask. What aspects of ethical representation apply and in your project, and how? What are the concepts of self-determination and reciprocity, and how do they interact with non-human communities? And how can deference to and respect for local relationships with the natural world and knowledge be genuinely incorporated into your project? I have learned a lot from putting camera traps up on my grazing project with elk. Elk have a fantastic sense of humor, and they're really playful. And I could not do my research without all of these partners, these non-human partners that work together and communicate across the landscape in ways that really facilitate the world that we live on. So I also like to think about the experience that they're having and what they're contributing. So those are some thoughts. Skill building, this is an ongoing thing. So some questions asked: does your team include specialists in social science research and community engagement? What additional certifications and competencies are necessary for success within the project? There's actually a formal toolbox workshop that's been developed by teams where you can go through this formal process of recognizing each other's worldviews and how you collect data and how you think about it and how you can learn together. It's kind of like a Myers-Briggs exercise or team building exercise. What can your team develop and improve in terms of interpersonal leadership and management skills, and how will your project be managed? I used to give this talk to like ecologists, and I would say, go to therapy, learn the skills you need to talk and lead with other people, because you probably got into natural resources because you want to be outside and you didn't realize how much you'd be working with other people. And if you don't have those skills, there's so many resources available now for you to gather that. Therapy is one way to do it. But now I also say, get used to talking about it. Talk about the issue, whatever that thing is, talk about it. So on a recent project I was on, we'd never talked about these like underlying assumptions the team had about the role of livestock grazing and climate change. And that was under the surface the whole time. If we would have just talked about that, I think we could have gotten a lot further. So any other thoughts about the skill building piece here?
Yeah, I just shared a sticky note. I was wondering if you might be able to share a little bit more about the toolbox that you referenced for teams to.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
share the
for sure.
citation.
Okay.
Because off the top of my head, it's not coming to mind, although I just looked it up yesterday. So I've done like a small group activity where there was a piece of it. And I will say, if you know, like when we go into social science, we have to learn things like what's your epistemology and what's your philosophy of science. And there are fields that just like take that for granted and haven't ever done that. But I do think most scientists are interested in it. So building that vocabulary is a big part of that toolbox. But I'll share that when I find it.
Thank you.
Put me on the spot. I think it's cited in this paper. So other implications or other thoughts for community-based natural resource management that might be on people's minds?
Yeah, feel free to just jump in. We've been talking about it the last 7 weeks, so hopefully there's a lot on your mind at this point.
How have you navigated your way, maybe being, I'm not as familiar with your work, but like being on the social scientist, like you said, coming into a very ecologist, like heavy team and being able to like voice your opinions and being able to sort of navigate the tensions between who holds power within like a transdisciplinary team like that?
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of my identity for a long time was like to be an empath and to really be like a warrior for these ideas, and to like I like come from more of like a rural community. I'm a first gen person, and I really like started to like almost become defensive of the ranchers I was working with, and I'd find myself kind of feeling like I was stiff arming scientists, trying to get them to be respectful. And like a big part of my identity became like explaining emotions to scientists. And I was headed for burnout quick with that. That is just not a sustainable like role. Although I would say there are people who are like really motivated to be kind of like a facilitator of that exploration for teams, and they can, host workshops like the toolbox, or the science of team science is like a growing field. But for me, it just became like really overwhelming to be in that zone. And I didn't feel like I was like getting anywhere with my science. I was just kind of explaining people to people all day, and they weren't really taking my advice. So after I moved to Forest Service, I was working in teams with a lot more women, and I didn't need to fill that role as much. And I started to like rethink where I was at and think about what I want to do. And so I moved away from project evaluation focused stuff and more towards like actually trying it in our own lab. So now I'm trying to do it, and I'm gonna, as best I can, implement these ideas, but also just like I also have to go and act. You have to get up in the morning. You might get hit by a car, but you got to get up, So I will probably make some mistakes I probably already have, and just be like, build steps into our projects where we're checking in on our values and we're checking in on what's happening, but not be afraid to act. As I think there is definitely a career path to evaluate research outcomes and to do these methods. And the next project I'll tell you about, I started out as an evaluation, like we were supposed to kind of evaluate if it worked or like how did participatory science work, and we steered back towards like, well, let's just come up with some activities or tools that work for us that we could use to get better. So.
No question.
Yeah.
Thanks for speaking with us today, Hailey. My question is regarding like in regards to community consent. I know it's like textually based and location based, but what does that look like in your experience, and how can we as early career researchers best approach that the concept of community consent?
Yeah, because it's really based on trust, right? And it's really based on like knowing the context that you're working in. So let me go through the next couple of slides, because actually we had a project where basically at one scale, the community leaders, there was a nonprofit that had been formed to kind of braid scientific knowledge with community needs to promote the long-term sustainability of the community. And they were working to get research funding to address some critical ecological questions. And so they were on board when, like, you know, sending in support letters and applying to grants. But when it came down to actually finding folks to work with, only 2 people in the community said yes. So it was kind of an introverted way of saying, we don't consent to this, or we're not interested. And there were a bunch of different explanations for that, but we had to kind of grapple with that because we were like originally going to sign 10 to 20 people up or something, and we didn't get there. So here's actually kind of like the tool set that we put together to deal with that and some other issues as well. So we called this project, or this paper is called Against Common Sense, Co-Producing Prairie Dog Research for Rangeland Conservation and Ranching Livelihoods. I don't know how many of you have worked in the Great Plains and know kind of what prairie dogs are, or you've seen them around Fort Collins probably, right?
There's about half nodding, yeah.
Okay, so here's a good, like the photo that Derek Scassa took is, you know, livestock grazing around prairie dog colonies, and this is the conservation context. So I'll just work through it really quickly. And essentially what we learned was there were 4 dimensions of context that you need to understand to really engage in the real world with your participatory research. And this is focused in Thunder Basin, which is basically between Douglas and Gillette, Wyoming. You can see the ecoregion is highlighted here. It's a pretty complex patchwork of land uses and it's an ecological gradient between the shortgrass and sagebrush steppe. So it's a pretty interesting hodgepodge of goals and values and land management regimes and actors and players. There are folks at the local scale and folks at the national scale, because it's such a important part of the Great Plains ecosystem. Has anybody been to Thunder Basin? Nobody's been. Okay, well, if you ever need to get away from the crowds in Colorado, they'll hate me for saying that, but.
And Hailey, I don't know if could you expand your screen just a little bit?
Yeah, let me put it back on and I've got a few, I'll send the slideshow, but there's quite a few wordy slides just so I could get the text correct, because we actually haven't published this yet. So just in the context of where researchers are trying to work with conservation groups and ranchers more to do participatory research, there's a lot of talk about participatory or transdisciplinary work as a way to find win-win solutions where you've got conservation challenges, but also livelihoods, and they're interconnected. But as those teams start to work together, we're finding that basically doing that work goes against their common sense. And I'm using common sense here in the sense of what Gramsci calls like an unquestioned or uncritical or unconscious way of assuming how the world works that we all hold. So if you're in conservation science or you're in social science, you come to a project with a certain view of how things operate that you maybe haven't reflected on. And that regardless of whether you're a layperson or a scientist, that may not be what's actually practically empirically going on. So, and this basically just comes from the idea that like for ranchers trying to conserve prairie dogs makes no sense. And for conservationists who see the agricultural community killing prairie dogs, working with the agricultural community makes no sense. So is there any common ground there? You're kind of following where I'm going. So here's kind of what that landscape looks like. This is a transect that Lauren Prensky at ARS's crew had on a prairie dog colony. So this has been denuded, and then the C3 grasses are starting to reappear after the prairie dog expansion. Prairie dogs play a really important role in the ecosystem as a keystone species, providing habitat and heterogeneity for a suite of other species across the Great Plains. So there's actually also a really cool postage stamp that shows this, these dynamics. But we know that it may not be a desirable looking landscape for livestock producers or just the general public. A lot of people that go by a prairie dog colony think, wow, this land has been destroyed or overgrazed. The same way that people might think, wow, a fire has ripped through this and taken away all the vegetation. So here's a conceptual framework for heterogeneity and conservation in the Great Plains that shows kind of the spectrum here on the bottom of vegetation structure and the suite of grassland birds, for example, that might live in those different structures. So if you're just managing for the middle, which is kind of what we've been telling ranchers to do for the last several generations, you're going to miss out on that heterogeneity on either side of that spectrum. And prairie dogs certainly land you in that bare ground side. This interacts with, it's a little bit more complicated than this. It interacts with scale and also with climate and weather, but that's kind of the framework for understanding that, you know, there's a suite of structures that maybe have different outcomes for wildlife, but they might be seen by ranchers as, you know, well, you have overgrazed, you've taken away the forage and we're going to have to buy feed, or maybe you left too much out there on this far end of the spectrum and you're wasting feed. So for risk management's sake, there's a lot of reasons to sort of try to manage for the middle. So the idea behind this participatory project that folks in Thunder Basin came up with was to work with ranchers to actually quantify the effects of the prairie dogs on their cattle weight gains. So do a participatory project where we're weighing cattle regularly on and off prairie dog colonies, and then work to provide that data to land managers like the Forest Service and individual ranchers to try to find a middle ground between the two goals. And basically, this is the virtual abstract for the project. Between my friend Ryan Wilbur and I were the two lead authors on this. We're just kind of, you know, presenting this conceptually here, but hey friend, how's the project going? Oh, it has ups and downs. What are you working on again? It's a big group project. We're working with ranchers to collect data on cattle weight gains, research to support ranching and prairie dog conservation at the same time. And the friend says, that makes no sense. We say, yeah, right, we're learning. The key is to pay close attention to context. And so that's what we kind of put together. I'll skip ahead to the picture of the framework here, where there are 4 elements of context that researchers can pay attention to that will help you operate in that real world setting with a more good sense instead of a common sense that's maybe not critical, but to reflect on what's going on. So the context of conflict, collaboration, and past engagement. Positionality, so where do you come from? Where do others in the project come from in terms of your relationship to discipline, to that particular place, to that system, your beliefs and your values? What ecological dynamics are ongoing during the process? And what is ownership of the community in the research process, which is kind of an outcome of all these things. But different people are going to have different motivations for participating, and they might not be the same as yours. And they might also see different risks that you don't see. For example, if someone who's been fighting for conservation or agricultural interests is being asked to collaborate, are they giving up their capacity to operate in that other ring where they are a little bit more on the fight? And so let's see, we worked through kind of these elements of positionality. Let's go back to the beginning. So history of conflict and collaboration. There were a lot of events that happened in the project, and we kind of realized there's sort of this river metaphor. There are all these like phases of context and history and structure that are running together. We might see them at very broad historical scales, or we might see them in relation to a specific project, but that project's going to be influenced by that context on multiple levels. So just piecing through like what happened on the project was pretty difficult for us to do. Positionality, there's a great couple of papers that have come out recently, but Jacqueline Mara-Beck has a great paper on reflexivity in conservation science. So this is the formal process of looking within, looking out at your project, looking back in time at the history of your field and how it relates to what's going on, and looking forward towards the future. And so we took interviews from people who participated in this project and thought through some of those elements, and coded their interviews in relation to like their perceptions and how they saw themselves. For example, at the very bottom of this, we have what was their relationship to community and ecosystem. So there were some really different sort of self proclaimed or sort of hinted at viewpoints. Some ranchers who didn't actually want us to weigh their cattle were sort of pioneers or settlers. And other folks who were maybe a little bit more collaborative with us were maybe seeing themselves as stewards of the community or of the land. The community NGO is really like a facilitator, setting a table that others could come work around. The rangeland ecologists were ecological experts. They're assessing trade-offs, but they care about the community, and they go up there for field work, but they don't live there. Whereas the conservation scientists were maybe seeing themselves as heart surgeons of the system. This is a really important ecological region to the whole Great Plains. They don't live there, they don't go up there that much, but they really see themselves as these heart surgeon experts of what's going on. So just those different worldviews place people in some really different positions. We also had a massive the project was actually kicked off by skyrocketing prairie dog populations. They were almost higher than anyone had seen in a very long time. And then they plummeted within a year due to a plague epizootic. So that dynamic alone set off a lot of social conflict, and then just like general apathy about the issue because there weren't any prairie dogs. Why do we need to do a prairie dog project? Ownership in the research, I think, sort of reflected all of that. Some people saw a lot of benefit. Other people didn't see any benefit at all. And I won't go into this like wordy table. And then we get back to sort of activities. So we put together some activities that teams could do to be aware of this, but basically it boils down to like build these concepts into your team process all the time. Think about how you are tracking what's going on and identifying context. If you haven't worked with history before, maybe you can find a historian who can give you some concepts and frameworks to think about, and how this manifested for the Thunder Basin group, which involves a lot of researchers who come and go from different fields, but the ARS and University of Wyoming folks are kind of the core of it. They actually put together this cool working draft document called How to Work in Thunder Basin, a guide for incoming researchers. And it covers kind of all of these elements. It's like, hello, welcome to rural Wyoming. Here's how we operate in this space. Here's what you need to know. Please wave to people on the road because they're going to be the ones that drag you out of the ditch when you drive off the road. Be sincere, respectful, keep everyone in the loop, suspend judgment. So we have, everything in there from what to do if you see a rattlesnake to like how to, understand what's going on in rural communities in Wyoming. So that is not a document we have like available, but it's a really cool idea. And I've actually started to try to draft my own for our lab here. Well, it's a work in progress. So that's an example to kind of build that culture. All right, I think we have a few minutes to chat more. There might be some more questions.
I have one, but I want to invite the student first. If anybody has questions or anything you're thinking about in relation to what's been shared.
Question. Thank you so much for being with us today. My question is about what have you seen so far working in this space that like has provided you with a sense of hope or joy or optimism or something like that?
Yeah, so I think that in natural resource management science, we have a really important disciplinary tradition that other fields need as there's, so I have friends that are like pure ecologists, and they do these like really cool models with like what happens if all the glaciers melt, where the salmon gonna go, you know, there are no people in that system. And when they go and they hang out in that system long enough, they start to draw the boxes and arrows and apply their systems thinking to what they're seeing, and they're coming around to our field. They're like, oh, like a friend yesterday was like, oh, we're committing genocide of the food system in Southeast Alaska with our regulations. And so like, you know, like I used to get really annoyed, like, oh yeah, you're just discovering this and you're gonna go put a nature paper together. Cool. Glad you noticed, you know, lots of people have been talking about this for a long time. But that's really encouraging that we have this discipline to then offer and build with them, because I think there's opportunities for us to learn more ecology if we're natural resource social scientists or natural resource managers. So that's really cool. And I think another thing is that the kind of quasi-local scale, people are learning to get beyond conflict towards a higher plane of understanding and respect with each other. I don't know that that's happening at the like regional and national level with all of our organizations, or if it ever could, but we're forced to talk to people. We're forced to like look them in the eye and think about the consequences for all these different players at the scale of like a national forest plan or in a system like Thunder Basin. So that's like an accountability to one another. So we still have that connection. And that's where you see collaboratives like the Malpai group or the Blackfoot Challenge or some other groups that have popped up that I think are kind of getting somewhere in terms of our thinking and our working together. So. Right, because in the end, like, wouldn't you think people that depend on the land and people that really care about conservation could be really powerful allies if they were in solidarity with one another to like exert, like at some scale, there's a mismatch of your goals, but at the broader scale, those things probably align. And you may look different than me and you may think different than me, but like maybe we're not the enemy. So in some cases you are, but I think in terms of like building common vocabulary and respect, I think I've seen some promising things lately. There's more of like a conversation about like, this is our tradition and we need to like be more collaborative.
Yeah, definitely. I think that aligns with one of the concepts we've been exploring here in the class around ethical space. It's the way we conceptualize it is attributed to Dr. Willie Ermine, who's a Cree elder and philosopher, and thinking about this space where different worldviews, different experiences are meeting and intentionally learning about each other and building those relationships. So yeah, I just see a lot of alignment resonating with what we've covered and what we're trying to even model and practice in facilitation in the class here. But I do have a question. I'm wondering, it's been a few years since the great webinar. I definitely recommend listening to the webinar, and the discussion was really good that was a part of it. But hearing about these processes, seeing the synthesis and the ethical principles that you and your team have shared, and these processes, participatory research, and thinking about how things that will benefit those communities, and then also just like protocols for consent, building relationship, listening and dialogue, all that's been emphasized. We know those all take so much time. And so I'm just really wondering if there's been any influence in terms of agencies or otherwise funding structures and like the timelines that are offered tied to funding.
Yeah.
And then what people consider, you know, impactful outputs, like journal articles and reports, thinking about accessibility versus other types of things that we create from our research or from these projects. Have you seen any significant change in these past few years? I imagine you are part of it, seeing some of what you shared here too, but yeah, I'm just kind of wondering about taking a pulse on the agencies, especially.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely becoming more apparent that the 3-year to 5-year funding cycle is just not going to work for this kind of thing. And so that really frustrates, you know, folks that are dependent on that when you say this isn't, you didn't get it done in 3 years. I think Yeah, that's definitely an issue. We've thought about creative ways around it, but if funding for extension, for example, funding for extension across the country was totally flat between 2008 and 2018, which was the most recent paper I could find. So resources are really, really tough. I'm really lucky at our agency that we're just like I was telling you, we're just kind of slow and old, and we're just kind of here. So there are agencies that are used to doing kind of long-term stuff, and we don't get a lot of funding necessarily for big, shiny. We're not as agile as other grant opportunities, and we're kind of maybe more stuck in our lane, but we're like still here and we have those long-term relationships. So it might be like rebuilding our connections on campus or across these agencies that already exist. It's definitely a challenge. And then, yeah, in terms of like direct benefit, I've heard of ranchers now like charging for their time. For example, if you want to do research on my cattle, I'll rent them to you, thinking of it as a business. Or other more direct benefits. And it's challenging for us as federal scientists because we are not allowed to make policy recommendations in our papers. So there's an example where I was brought onto a paper pretty late, but there's a paper we published from Southeast Alaska on harvesting wood products for cultural services. So the community was saying we want access to harvest old growth for our traditional carving. And you can download an app to get a Christmas tree, but like it's really hard for us to get legal access to this wood that is really important to us. And so like we can do social sciences as the community really wants this, but we, as federal scientists, like we need like a community organization to take that data and figure out how to work into the bureaucracy to make that happen. And so the science is not action, right? You need to have partnerships with people that are reading it or working with it a little bit more. So
Thanks for that. I also wanted to, if folks still have a question, we just have 5 minutes remaining, but if you have any questions you want to ask the students, I want to invite you as well. You're welcome to ask a question.
I don't know, other comments or areas that you're working in or things you're running into, feedback. Is this the way to, do transdisciplinary approaches? Are they overblown? Are they worth looking into? Are they appealing? Do they look like they're unethical from the beginning? Is there another way to go? Yeah, sorry.
No, you're fine. I just had a quick question. Have you seen like some positive outcomes coming between the conservation work between the cattle ranchers and prairie dog conservation? So I'm working in like a similar field, but native fish conservation and water, and it is similarly like butting heads about like ag needs water for crops and that. So I was just wondering what positives have come out of that cooperation.
Yeah, it's just been on a much smaller scale. So after this project, I think there was one family that was like, hey, yeah, we'll nerd out with you. Here's what we would like. And so it's definitely going slower. And I think it started with like a researcher and a rancher sitting around having some beers, and then they put some collars on some cows, and it kind of, I think there was like porcupine soup involved. I'm not really sure. So it like went in circles. And the researchers being like, we're going to stay here and we're going to, keep working on this, and we don't need immediate outcomes, I think helped with that. But there'll always be these other scales of conflict that are going on, and that has consequences, right? Like that has consequences for people's lives and jobs, families. And so it's pretty messy space. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. I'll drop the question if anyone has a burning question. I do want to invite you first. Okay. My question is that you were a student in this class. It was a different era, as we know. We were both PhD students together, but what is something that you took from taking this class that has really been helpful to you in your practice? CBNRM.
The other students in this class were fantastic, and they really challenged my like pretty neoliberal thinking about international development. They really challenged my understanding of of like what communities are, and really challenged me to think about that in my own work, and like to try to keep up with them and live up to what they were doing, and to like model it, you know. So if you're teaching the week on participatory stuff, like, is your process actually participatory, or are you just talking about it? And that that comes up even now. Like next week I'm giving a talk on participatory science, but the organization set it up as a bunch of lectures. Like, you know, which this kind of is too, and you're sort of expected to do that, but just sort of like, how are you modeling it, and who are your role models and peers and things. I also think the literature in this class is like extremely fundamental, and you know, Hardin is going to come up like a lot, and the challenges to that and the limitations of how we think about that are so important, and you're going to have to like face down colleagues in the future with what you know, and like do the reading so you know what you know. You know, because you're going to need it, or I've needed it anyway.
Yeah, awesome. It's great to see think about the connections you all will have beyond this course and just your time working together, getting to know one another. But I do want to say, Dr. Hailey Wilmer, you've been someone I've always respected and admired in the work that you do. And I think at a time where people weren't talking a lot about these things, like engaging diverse ways of knowing and really thinking about genuine engagement and respect within communities that are partners in our work, you were already thinking critically and out loud about it in your work. And it was inspiring to me. And I do feel like there's sort of a critical mass building now around this approach, which gives me a lot of hope in this field, to see the creativity too, and just like the genuine way, like the genuine good human being, where you said, don't be a jerk frameworks that people are bringing to the work. Just so much respect. And I know you're a busy person, so it's a real gift to have your time for you to connect with the students, and let's all just give our thanks. So yeah, thank you so much. We'll free you up for the rest of your day, and I'll be reaching out to you so we can just share little thanks your way as well. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's a huge honor to meet you all.
Yeah, I would love to, if you send anything, like things that were in the works as you're developing them, any publications or frameworks or toolkits as they come out. I'd love to share them with the students throughout the season. So please just share them our way, and we'll be happy to get the good word out. Good things are coming, I can tell. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll be seeing you.
See you later.
Let's also thank Katie from the FRS department, our amazing communications and John Wizard, for helping us make this happen today. So thank you, Katie. All right, and we'll go ahead and shift to a break, everyone.